All right. Hey, thanks everyone. Sorry, I've got a dog that's kind of right on top of me and having a bit of a nervous, he's having a bit of a nervous, uncomfortable talk about things that are inconvenient. The narrative in American politics is that there's two sides. There's a red versus blue. It boils down for most people. That means it's the lesser of two evils. But what it does is that means that it glosses over, it hides, it doesn't allow to be spoken about the idea that there are things that the two corporate parties, the parties of war and Wall Street, share. One of those is the war on drugs. Yeah, war on drugs begins in 1971, although its roots are much deeper and longer than that. Certainly, the various aspects of the war on drugs, its class aspects, and most especially its racial aspects, have much longer histories than that. If people really want to get a good handle on that, and particularly if you're looking for where to begin on understanding how the war of drugs, you have slavery that then transitions into the incarceration of the post-Civil War period, the forced labor that comes with that, then transitions into Jim Crow, which then transitions into the war on drugs. And if people want to get if you're not too familiar with that history, how this all works, how that type of oppression evolves, it's in itself, it's a living organism, right? It reminds me of Steinbeck in The Grapes of Wrath, talking about the banks, how the banks have to grow. They have to if they don't keep growing, they're going to die because they are a living organism. We see that with a lot of different things, with a lot of structures, a lot of institutions. And one of it is, how do we enforce a hierarchy in this country that enables money to rise to the top, to simplify it, to make it kind of as easy to explain as possible? How do we allow for a system that requires class oppression, which then, of course, requires racial oppression, in order to make sure that all the money continues to go to the top? People are kept down, wages are kept down. 51 years, right? Longer than I've been alive. I was born in 73. Anything that was said there about the purposes, can anyone say, it doesn't make sense, it didn't shake out that way? It certainly didn't have that effect of oppressing entire communities, particularly people of color. So what we see is that the war on drugs being a political tool, used to oppress and control. And the results of that, certainly this was not going to make things better for people. This was not going to make this a fairer, freer, more equitable land. And certainly this type of policy was not going to create stability within communities. It was going to do the exact opposite. And we certainly see that. And I think with the war on drugs, we have two offshoots of it that are particularly important to talk about, and particularly as that affects communities, affects families, affects individuals. One is the mass incarceration piece, where we see where the war on drugs particularly picks up speed under the Reagan administration. And you see our prison population explode. It goes from a point in the 70s where you have hundreds of thousands of prisoners to a point in 2019 where we have more than 2.5 million prisoners in the United States. I think a lot of people are familiar with this, the fact that we have about 4% of the world's population and about 20% of the world's prison population, that we are the biggest prison nation in the world. And the mass incarceration that comes out of the war on drugs is a major contributing factor to that. Depending upon how it's measured and whether you're looking at county or state or federal prisons, the people who are in these prisons range from anywhere from 1 in 5 to as much as close to as 1 in 3 on drug offenses. So you have hundreds of thousands, millions of people over the lifetime of these policies who have been just absolutely ruined because they smoked the plant, right? And for so many people, particularly say with marijuana, the marijuana is medicine. So you can reduce that further to like smoking their medicine. And certainly there are, other aspects of this when you get into your other narcotics, your cocaine, your heroin, methamphetamine, certainly the opioid crisis as we've seen unfold over these last years, and now with the extension of that, the fentanyl crisis that we're in. All of that comes out of prohibition, though. And none of this tough on crime. We're going to fully resource the federal government, the war on drugs. We're going to have a drug czar. We're going to spend billions and billions of dollars. We're going to turn our police departments into the largest armies in the world. The New York City Police Department is the third largest army in the world. Like only the Chinese spend more on their military than New York does on its police department. I mean, so you start to look at that, and I think certainly the war on terror then contributes to that. The fear that people have that the government then utilizes for its purposes, and we have a militarization of the police over the last 20 years. But all that keeps going back to the war on drugs. And again, it has been something that has been absolutely ruinous. You see the extent that parole and probation have on people in terms of the constant following through their lives, the fact that they can never get away from this. I've seen people in my neighborhood who the probation officer comes and the guy's got to stand there in front of his kids while this guy with a gun on his hip is interrogating their father, humiliating the guy, right? All because of what? Some drug charge from 10 years ago? So you see this mass incarceration piece, which has done has been so effective in crippling the Black and brown communities as well as rural white communities. And one of the things that we've just had happen here in North Carolina, which is a great thing, is that people with felonies have been re-enfranchised politically. But this was something that, if you go and you look at the numbers in terms of how many people across the United States have been disenfranchised because of criminal convictions, because of felonies, how many of those are drug related? And you start to see where you have hundreds of thousands, bordering on millions of Americans who have been denied their political rights because of drug convictions. I mean, so I could be here much longer talking about the mass incarceration piece, but I want to move over to the overdose piece, the public health piece, because what we have too is that it goes hand in hand with this, right? If we've treated for decades now people with substance abuse and addiction issues as if they were criminals. That substance abuse and addiction is taken as a law enforcement matter more so than a public health matter. And I think this is what really distinguishes us from any other political party out there, because we do share space on this issue with the libertarians. But where the libertarians stop in terms of that, prohibition is counterproductive, it's futile, and mass incarceration is morally unjust, wrong, again, counterproductive, futile. Where we break with the libertarians on this, I believe, is that we also see ending the war on drugs as having a major public health component. So, one of the things that we see, as Rose said, is a worsening situation, worsening returns on the investment, if you will, on this war on drugs. More and more people overdose every year. You get to the point now where in North Carolina, we have 12 overdose deaths a day. That's 12 times a day. Somebody's son, somebody's daughter, someone's, in my case, coming out of the combat veteran community, because you see this, because so many guys come home and they're either physically messed up or they're mentally, emotionally, spiritually messed up. And they end up turning to drugs because the resources aren't there to help them. They're in pain. They're dealing with something that other people can't help them. I mean, start talking about issues of moral injury. People, I can understand, and I'll say this a lot. I'll say I'm glad I had a problem with alcohol, because alcohol was good enough for me, right? Alcohol would embrace my problems and allow me to be who I needed to be when I was dealing with those dark times after the war. A lot of people don't have that relationship with alcohol, so they try and find something else. And so among, say, combat veterans, you end up seeing guys move into the quote harder unquote drugs, if you will. And then of course you combine that with physical issues, and you start to see within the combat veteran community this real issue of drug overdose. And that's why I can say, at the beginning of this campaign, I said, I got to figure out how many people I know who've OD'd. And I counted six people dead from overdose deaths over the last 10 years I know. Right? Last one I know was one of the corpsmen in my in my unit in Iraq. Corpsmen, for those you don't know, are your medics. That's what we call them in the Marine Corps. They're Navy corpsmen, and they're our medics, and they're really beloved because they take care of you. And Doc Henley, we call those guys Doc. Doc Henley OD'd God bless him, after a tough deployment a bunch of years ago, a year and a half ago, he OD'd. Whether it was suicide or whether it was an accident, it doesn't matter. Certainly doesn't matter to his wife and his kids, right? And you see this over and over again. And I'm just talking about a tiny spectrum here, right? What I know, what I live in, who I know, the funerals I attend, the people I know whose lives have been shattered by this. Expand that out. And again, 12 times that happened today. In the United States, last year, about 110,000 overdose deaths total. Again, if there's not a better indicator that the war on drugs has been a failure and has been counterproductive and is unjust, then look at those families. Along with the mass incarceration piece, the only thing that has benefited from that has been the prison industrial community complex, right? I mean, the law enforcement agencies, the federal, state, local industries that are riding the gravy train, right? As we say in the Marine Corps, riding the gravy train with biscuit wheels. Because they get all this money to fight the war on drugs, and so it becomes a circular, self-fulfilling, and then you tie in why do we have these addiction issues? Why are people so desperate to be out on the streets slinging drugs for $100 a day? Who is that? You start to see all these things, and you see a real dysfunction that's very insidious and that rots away our society from the inside. And so, whatever motives Nixon and Ehrlichman and Dean and all those evil people had in the early 70s to control, to subjugate, to punish, this has far exceeded their expectations, far exceeded their desires. And, you look at what's being done now. The Biden administration comes in saying they're going to do something about marijuana legalization. They don't. They're actually making it the easiest stat I can throw out is that marijuana arrests under Joe Biden have gone up 25%. The most arrests for marijuana by the federal government in the last 10 years occurred last year, right? So, it's been a deliberate policy to go after people, to pursue the war on drugs. Same thing too, one of the things as we've seen fentanyl come into play, and fentanyl is, it's a synthetic drug for people who know what fentanyl is. You don't have to grow it. You don't need fields. You don't need farmers. You need a bunch of barrels, some tubes, like a science kit, and the precursor chemicals. Most of that stuff comes from China, and here in the United States, most of it's made in Mexico. And then it comes in through all our ports of entry, right? Through all the great border wall. That's where it all comes in. So the whole thing is such a sick joke. But anyway, with the fentanyl, what you saw happen in the Trump administration, Trump administration did what Joe Biden was famous for in the 90s by doing with his 94 crime bill, where they really went after drugs, right? And they really weighed heavily on crack. Okay, and not on cocaine because white people do cocaine, but crack because black people do cocaine. Black people do crack. And so you had these. That's where you got these 3 strikes and you're out. These mandatory minimum sentences. All these horror stories you hear about people going to jail for life because they had like a smidgen of marijuana, right? So we've seen the Trump administration make the same type of real harsh penalties for fentanyl use. Doesn't do anything on the demand. It doesn't do anything to affect demand. Doesn't do anything to negate supply. Doesn't do anything because all you're doing every time you take off a guy off the street who's selling fentanyl, who's making about $100 a day, maybe $200 a day. Every time you take that guy off the street, another guy replaces him because people are desperate. So, but what that does is repeats the same, and I don't want to call them mistakes because I don't think they were mistakes. But the Biden administration keeps in place those types of harsh sentences, right? Those harsh guidelines. And so, what we're living in here is just a policy that was birthed in the desire to control, abuse, subjugate, and punish people, whole classes of people, whole communities of people, entire races of people. It has been extended, expanded, and both about mortality. And Rose brought up the deaths of despair. And we see that with the increase in suicides, the increase of overdoses. One of the things life expectancy for Americans continues to go down. So that over the last couple years, last 3 years, life expectancy for all Americans has gone down 2.6 years. And that's only kept up because white people, for the most part, have it better than other people. If you're a Native American, your life expectancy in the last 3 years has gone down 6.6 years. I mean, that's a whole other webinar we can do, but that is the genocide of the American of the indigenous people of these lands that has been going on for more than 500 years. What else would you call a life expectancy drop of 6.6 years targeted on one group other than genocide, right? But when you pull apart those numbers and say, well, where does this life expectancy drop come from? And you see half of it's related to the pandemic, a whole other thing we should be talking about, right? But the pull that apart, half of it's from pandemic, about 25 or 30% is from accidental death. Which also includes suicide somehow as accidental. I'm not really sure, but within that, you pull that out and you see about half of that number then goes to overdoses. So you can see when you start talking about having 110,000 overdose deaths a year, that starts to actually affect our life expectancy. Right? I mean, that's how serious this is. That's how widespread it is. That's how detrimental it is. And of course, you think about the people who are left behind, all the foreshortened futures, all the dreams that will never come about, all the kids who grew up without parents. And we could be here and use an addiction, and it needs to end. And that is one of the things I intend to do if I'm in the U.S. Senate, is bring about an end to the war on drugs. So I appreciate everyone being here. I'm sure there's probably a ton of good questions. We had a ton last week, and certainly, I look forward to taking some of the questions and chatting with you in this format as best we can.
Thank you, Matt. And before I get to questions, I want to add that I read some of the history of marijuana criminalization, and that some of that history was actually related to the rise of plastics and the interest in getting rid of hemp, which, and as we know, plastics have done and continue to do massive damage. And so it was started in a completely racist campaign. And some of it was directly that marijuana use made white women want to have sex with black men.
Yeah.
That was literally the selling point. Was it?
They made movies about that in the 20s and 30s. That type of thing, where like the white woman would get high and then she'd go off with a black guy. Like there are actual films that they made about that. Yeah.
Yes. So the combination of jazz music and marijuana, and there was somebody like in Congress who made this whole speech that will destroy the morals of the white woman and make her want to have sex with black men. And I mean, so at the heart of this, talk about intersectionality. The heart of this was bringing us over to plastics instead of hemp, because, why not have things made with something cheap that is not biodegradable and is, as people know, environmentally disastrous. And combine that with the xenophobia and racism. And this is how we found ourselves with this destructive campaign against a plant. So I have two questions here, both from Chris Leduc. Hi, Chris.
Hey, Chris.
So the first one is, what are your thoughts on the baby step bill? 1, declare a climate emergency. 2, prohibit cruel, unusual, and degrading punishment. 3, define healthcare as a human right. Sound good?
Yes. I mean that Chris, Chris had brought this up to me a day or two ago, and I said, please remind me about this and ask me about it, because it really is. It's one of the things is there's so much that needs to be done. There's like almost everything is a priority in terms of what people are dealing with, the way people are suffering, the way people are being left behind, the way they're drowning, the way they're dying. I mean, I said it before, just with the healthcare, the pandemic, and the fact that 1 in 3 deaths in the pandemic are attributable to a lack of healthcare insurance. I mean, like that itself should be talked about every day throughout the country about how people are dying in the hundreds of thousands because they don't have the money in their checking account to get to the doctor to have a reasonable standard of health care. I mean, and we can go on from there, right? I mean, there's so many other things that are as pressing: the housing, the jobs, the war on drugs, climate. The border policies. I mean, what's happening with our LGBTQ plus brothers and sisters and family members and friends and neighbors, what's happening with abortion in this country. I mean, it's so many things that are pressing. It's hard to prioritize. And I like what Chris has here with this baby step bill because it is, to repeat it, it just hits three things that are unescapable in terms of like how important they are and what they actually mean. The first is declare a climate emergency, which the president. This should have been done in the '80s. When I was a nerd when I was a kid, and I remember watching, like being 15 years old and watching the vice presidential debates and Dan Quayle talking about climate change. Calling it global warming, of course, then. But and I remember, in the vice presidential debate with Lloyd Benson saying that climate change, is an issue, or global warming. I mean, it should have been declared an emergency decades ago. And unfortunately, as we discussed a couple of weeks ago, this current administration is paying lip service to it. They're dressing up their Inflation Reduction Act, which doesn't do anything about inflation, also does very little about climate. At best, it would be neutral on climate, I believe. And then, but the second one is something I don't think we speak enough about: prohibit cruel, unusual, and degrading punishment. And that fits in with the war on drugs, right? Because again, we're putting people in prison. The Biden administration, the federal government, last year increased marijuana arrests by 25%, I think 26% actually, right? And you look at that and you say, for what? Because people are smoking their medicine? They're putting them in jail for that? I didn't even touch into the whole racket that involves the pharmaceutical industry, right? I didn't get into any of that. Like, we could have been here all night talking about all that kind of stuff. The money involved in this, who benefits. You see here in North Carolina, the reason why I think that we don't have a medical marijuana bill yet in this state. We got the state Senate put one through, a terrible bill. The House rejected it, not because it was terrible, because it wasn't terrible enough. And what I mean by that is that my understanding is, the way I see it, is our state legislatures, like as has happened in many other states, they want to make sure that any marijuana industry in the state becomes the newest addition to the pharmaceutical industry. Right. So they want to make sure that this is not locally grown marijuana, that this is not something that benefits small farmers and businesses, that this is something that the pharmaceutical industry can come in, take over, and make money off of. But, this idea of cruel, unusual, and degrading punishment, that goes even farther into the whole prison system we have. The 2.5 million, 2.6 million people who are in prison, the millions more who are in probation and on parole, whose lives have been ruined, as well as the conditions that they're kept in, the forced slavery. People are aware. We have corporations that make billions of dollars every year off of prison labor, which is in effect slave labor. I don't think anyone has too much of a problem with prisoners who want to get out and work, who, or you're going to have them do something beneficial for the community, the state, whatever, However, what we're talking about is corporations that use prison labor for their profits. And these men and women get paid, cents every hour, literal cents. So yeah, I mean, Chris, I really like it, as you can tell. Please send me more information about it, and it's definitely something I'll keep bringing up.
Thank you. Okay, we've gotten a few more questions, so I'm going to mix it up some. And podcast by George, who is a regular attendee of these webinars. I can't quite see you, but it's good to see you, George. Wants to know your thoughts on psychedelics for treatment of PTSD.
Oh,
just to add, there's been states like Colorado that have allowed certain psychedelics legal status. So, but what are your thoughts on that?
Oh, I think it's again, this should have been pursued decades ago. And there have been people in this country who've been working on this for decades. And Colorado is actually a really great state for it. The Colorado state government is actually very good about it. The federal government's the biggest impediment to it. But the use of plant-based medicine, um, everything I have seen, everything I've read, and I've spent some time looking at this. You look at the work, say, done at Johns Hopkins University. John Hopkins University has done a number of studies on psilocybin, mushrooms, if you will. And you see the reports that they have, the study participants, upwards of 70% of them saying that one experience with psilocybin, with mushrooms, is the most important experience of their life. And these are people in their middle age, right? These are people who've been through things, who've had experiences, you know. And so, and that is replicated in study after study in the US and around the world. Then there's also a long history of the use of plant-based medicine that goes back well before recorded history. And I think we most especially identify it through indigenous cultures. And I think there's an aspect of appropriation that has to be touched on here, because you do have this idea that, say, ayahuasca, which has a lot of roots in indigenous culture in the Americas. You know, this idea that you're going to have, again, corporations, the well-to-do, coming in and taking something that doesn't belong to them to profit off of. So I think there's aspects of this that you have to be careful with. But in terms of generally plant-based medicine, I think it should have been something that we really needed to have leaned into decades ago in terms of the research and development. That's really changed over the last 10 years. I'm excited to see what's going to come from it. I mean, I have met, at this point, I feel like dozens of people who have utilized plant-based medicine, and there's a variety of different types, to great benefit, right? And the tropes about it, Rose, what you talked about before, about like going back 100 years and the idea of the demonization of marijuana, and like kind of tying it to black people, and all the tropes that went with that, and all the bigotry and stereotypes and everything else that tied into that. You know, the stereotypes, the identification of plant-based medicine with the hippie, the stoner, and no offense if you're a hippie or a stoner, but I think folks would know what I'm talking about here, right? The idea that this is something that quote normal unquote people don't utilize. And forgive the use of my language and semantics here. I don't mean to offend anyone with any of that, but I think people recognize that we do have a culture that, because again of the war on drugs, the history of it that predates it decades, the ties with racism, Jim Crow, class oppression, etc., have made the use of substances of plant-based medicines heretical in this country, when in fact, again, they've been used for millennia by various civilizations around the world, and their effects are well demonstrated, very beneficial, very helpful, and everything that keeps coming out is in that vein. So, you know, I probably, George, I should have just said, yes, I agree, and not run my mouth anymore, but you know how
I
am.
ask my next question of you, I have to add something. And I willingly admit this was not legal at the time. But when I was in culinary school in my early 40s, you know, drugs were easy to get there. And culinary school was a brutal experience for me. I mean, I made it through it. Brutal. 40 years old, and you're surrounded by extremely wealthy 19-year-old people who look like fashion models. And then there's me, and French chefs that didn't like me. And so, you know, psychedelic mushrooms was something, as I saw myself going through an emotional crisis, and it was not something I was a regular user of, but I decided maybe this would help. And I remember a young man seeing the bag I got and going, Rose, don't take all of those at once. It's going to be dangerous. They're a young man. I don't plan to do that. Like, no, really? No, whoa. But the truth is, it actually exactly psychologically what I thought it would help me with, it did help me with. And no, this wasn't under the direction of doctors, but I think people who have used certain kinds of drugs have understood, without the benefit of medical legitimacy, that there's ways that these are things that can help in emotionally stressful situations. And of course, where that line is when people start abusing drugs because the pain is too much. So.
Right. Right. Yeah, it is. The variety and the scale and the depth of the various things that these types of medicines can be used to help with, medicines that are, again, plant-based, not pharmaceuticals. And one thing that we have to be careful of, so the variety that it could be is massive. I mean, like the different things that can be treated with these types of medicines is massive. Where we have to be very careful, I think, going forward, and this is where you talk about start like a legislative role, is making sure the profit motive is not there, right? Because so much that we're talking about tonight connects back then to the pharmaceutical industry, right? And the opioid crisis that we have here, certainly, look, I mean, and people, if people are interested, I could send you some writings and some things I've done about the American involvement in the drug trade overseas through our wars, which is something that goes back to the British and the Opium Wars. We learned it from them. I mean, this is certainly something that occurs in the Mediterranean and Italy and France after World War II, the involvement with the Americans in drug trafficking in order to keep the communists at bay. The bedfellows that are made. And bedfellows are a polite word, but certainly what happens in Vietnam. Certainly, I saw someone in the comments mentioning Gary Webb. If people are not familiar with Gary Webb's story, as soon as we're done here, go and look up Gary Webb, W-E-B-B. Gary Webb was a journalist who exposed the drug smuggling being conducted by the Nicaraguan Contras with the full complicity of the American CIA that occurs at the time of the crack epidemic in the 80s in the United States. And everyone told Gary Webb he was crazy. He was later a suicide victim. Obviously not suicide, but I mean, so that history is there. And what occurred in Afghanistan was the same exact thing. So certainly the opioid epidemic coming at the same time as we have our occupation of Afghanistan, where our allies are the ones who control the Afghan drug trade, not the Taliban. Our allies are, the ones who control the Afghan drug trade. And that drug trade makes up 85% of the world's illicit opiates. And that occurs at the same time as the opioid epidemic really explodes in the United States, or as well as around the world. Come on, there's no coincidences or something that. So anyway, but the point being is how much the pharmaceutical industry is tied all into this, right? And as we're seeing more and more understanding that the role of these mega corporations in pushing these drugs on people, the complicity of doctors, and how that just victimized and ruined, millions of families across this country. And so understanding that and being very careful moving forward with plant-based medicine so that the profit motive is not there. The care motive is there, the public health motive is there, but the profit motive is not there, because otherwise they will be abused in the same way that we've seen really all our other pharmaceuticals abused.
All right, I am going to ask one more question, and because we're trying to move these along a little quicker, but please do feel free to write me. I'm going to put my email in. I've done this before, and we can keep this conversation going. So I'm sorry if we weren't able to get to your question tonight, but this has been a really lively conversation. And the last question is from Brian Gay, who wants to know your thoughts on harm reduction strategies for substance abuse disorders, such as needle exchange programs, safe injection sites, mobile testing centers for infectious diseases, etc.
Correct. And I saw, Brian, you have another question there where you're talking about untreated trauma, mental illness. And I think that ties all into that, because, ultimately what you're talking about doing with the war on drugs is replacing war on drugs with universal health care, right? Replacing the war on drugs with a Medicare for all system that is fully encompassing, right? That is holistic, that all those things that have been addressed, particularly say mental health issues, trauma, psychiatric and psychological care. Those types of things are all covered under a Medicare for All system that everyone has access to without cost. I think that is what is the ultimate answer, the correct answer, the correct rebuttal to the war on drugs. Utilizing a public health system so that people are able to get the substance abuse and addiction help, the mental health help, whatever it is that they need to get through the pains, difficulties, the problems, the issues in their lives. I mean, certainly I've been a recipient of that. I have benefited from that. The VA has saved my life. And I want to make clear too, when I talk about the pharmaceutical industry, I'm not dismissing medication, because I take a medication that allows me to do this. I take a medication that controls my brain injury symptoms. If I didn't have this medication, I couldn't be doing this. I couldn't be doing much. So medication has its place and its role, and it's important, but the profit motive. But, the harm reduction, Brian, is something that's really important. It's something that people demonize. I just had some person on Twitter asked me this today about it, oh, you'd rather have, so you're in favor of people going and shooting up on the government's dime in some safe space, and I said, yeah, absolutely. If the option is to have people go to a facility where they can safely take their drugs and have the resources available to help them as well, if that's one option, and the other option is this current system we have where people die 12 times a day from overdose deaths, I'm going to go with the harm reduction, the safe spaces, the safe injection sites, all these different mechanisms that we have seen work around the world. We've seen work in communities here in the United States. I'm going to take that every day over the 12 deaths that occurred today in North Carolina because of overdoses, right? I mean, what we could do to help people, to be compassionate, to treat our neighbors as if they were us, to follow all the great dictates that this supposed Christian nation adores, right? And I would do those things over and over again. And that's part of ending the war on drugs. That's part of creating a more compassionate and just and fair society, is having those things available to all people who need them. Because again, I got the help I needed because my problem was alcohol, right? And that is considered okay. That's not offensive. It's alcohol. It's not, and there's, and one of the things about the VA, the way the VA does its substance abuse is it puts you all together. So you're in with, if your thing is alcohol, your thing is cocaine, that person's thing is meth, whatever it is, you're all in there together, because the root problem is, I don't want to say it's the same, but it's fundamentally agreeable, right? So, that's what it comes down to, is that we've not treated everybody the way they needed to be treated, and we've ignored them, we've victimized them, we've made sure corporations made profits, and then we'll go back to, again, the Ehrlichman quote and the utilization of this to destroy the anti-war left and the Black community, the enemies of Richard Nixon. And, I think that's probably as good a place to leave it as anywhere. People want to follow up with me on this. I will be happy to talk more about it. Shoot me an email, send me a message on Twitter or Facebook, and certainly happy to talk more about it. But I do think that ending the war on drugs, particularly the public health component, is one of several things, many things that sets us apart from the other campaigns in this race. And it's something that is desperately needed because people are dying.
Thank you, Matt. This has been a great discussion, and now anyone who's been to these before know that this is the time where we start to have to talk, about fundraising. And I need people to know that we really do need to be able to have robust fundraising, to be able to finish strong. The Democrats were afraid to have Matt on the ballot. And we won and they lost, but they were able to keep us mirrored in these legal battles that did do harm. did do harm in terms of what we can do as campaigners and how much we can get Matt's name out there. And this is an important campaign. And I would like to see Matt be in the US Senate, where he can have this fight for the people. So I'm asking people tonight, can you donate, and can you even do the maximum? Could you be the hero who could do the maximum of $2,900? Because amounts like that, it can put us in a position to do so much more. So, you know, I know that these are high amounts I ask for, and sometimes I actually feel a little embarrassed to do it, but you know what? We need to be able to get this campaign and Matt out there as much as possible. And I really want people to step up, be the heroes who can make this happen. I am going to, because I realize I haven't even put in the fundraising link. Why didn't somebody yell at me about that?
I know we got all these people on the back end who are supposed to be guiding us, and
Well, I guess I needed guidance on that one. And usually I'm very good about putting it out. Fundraising link.
But to follow,
Somehow,
to put a point on what Rose was saying, we spent the first 5 months of this campaign, roughly 5 months, 4 to 5 months of this campaign, getting signatures on paper, getting on the ballot. Everything we did was for that. All the money we raised went into that. Then we spent the next 2.5, almost 3 months fighting the state of North Carolina and the Democratic Party, the DSCC, in U.S. District Court, Federal Appeals Court, and also in state court. And only now, here we are, like 9 weeks, 2 months till 2 days. It's actually 2 months to the election today. Are we able to fully and freely campaign? And so we have a plan to get around the state. We're going to attend festivals every weekend, go to where the people are, introduce ourselves to them, listen to them. I had a great experience in Nashville last weekend at the Goombay Festival, which was a big Afro-Caribbean festival. We talked to a lot of people and, learned a lot about Asheville, learned a lot about Western North Carolina. That's our plan, is to do that, as well as, too, the targeted advertising, getting on the streaming platforms, having billboards, letting people know that we are an option, letting people know that there are candidates out there who talk about things like ending the war on drugs and who will do it. And in order to do that, though, we need money, and we need the money for a whole host of reasons, as you can imagine. So if people are able to support us now that we're at this point where we can campaign, where we won, we did the ballot access, we won, we defeated them in court, we won, and now it's on to the campaign to win here. And so if people can help, as Rose said, with the max donation of $2,900, that would do so much for us.
Yes, and if you can't do that much, would you be able, if there's anyone here who could even do $2,000, again, that would be, a massive amount in terms of being able to get Matt's message out there. So because I don't want to keep people here all night, I'm trying to move a little faster. But again, I want to stress, and of course, any donation, you're my hero. Anyone who's trying to change this disease system and save the lives of the people we love who are suffering and are doing drugs because they need to, mentally, they need to check out from so much pain in their lives that the lives we're living here in the US is bringing on. When you don't know if you have enough money to keep your lights on, if you don't know if you have enough money to keep a roof over your head, if you're living with this much uncertainty, this is a painful existence to live in. I understand very well why people drown their problems in things like liquor and drugs. But we need to be a society that can do better, that can give more, that can help people. And Matt is the only person running for office who's coming with this vision. Yes, as Joan says, look at how many homeless people. I spent time with a friend this week, and he essentially lives in his car. And he figures out how to get by doing that. And he works. There are people who are working, but they still can't keep a roof over their heads in this mass gentrification. And now what, one out of every 4 homes is now owned by the banks. As people were foreclosed on, the banks came in and scooped up those properties. I mean, this is a hard existence for so many people. So if you could do $1,000 tonight, if you'd be capable of doing that, again, this is something that's going to help put us in a position to get the word out there, to promote Matt everywhere we go. And we had a great weekend, as he was saying. I was out in North Carolina for the Goombay Festival. And there's people, as Matt gets out there, people are going to remember that the other candidates aren't coming out to meet them. They aren't coming out. They go into the most controlled of environments. They are not just going to go out in the street and say, hi, I'm running for a Senate. You know, can I talk to you about what your needs are? Matt's the only one doing that. And so we need to get this message out there. So I'm asking people, can you do $500? If there's anyone out there who could do $500, please do. Here's the link again.
And, you know, give you an idea of what $500 does for us is $500 lets us get to one of these festivals, because it costs a few $100s to get the booth space. And then, you know, we've got to pay for our folks to be there, gas and hotel money, and, you know, all of it adds up. And so $500 allows us to be someplace where, you know, one of the things we do when we're at these festivals, we have our signs and our literature and everything else. And, you know, one of the signs we have, and you know, people who've been with us for a while will recognize that we've got a legalize it sign, marijuana leaf, but it also says very clearly, boldly, end the war on drugs, because it's just not about marijuana. But every time we're someplace, and every time I've been doing this, I have people come to me and tell me about their experiences, whether it's people themselves. Just had, when I was in Asheville, just had a couple people talk to me about how they got arrested for marijuana and it's not leaving them. Their lives they are shackled by that arrest that happened years ago, because again, they were smoking medicine. You know, the other side then too are the families, the moms especially, who come up and tell us about their children who have been lost to overdose, or in some cases they weren't lost, but nearly lost, but have been in prison, and all the things that come out of this war on drugs. And so really the poignancy of it. And that allows us to get out there and connect with people and give people an idea that, again, there's someone out there, there's a campaign out there that wants to speak about these and will change this if given the opportunity. So people who can support us, you know, with $500, you know, anything is such a boon to us, such a benefit to us. So grateful for whatever anyone can do.
Yes. So if anybody tonight could do $100, $50, but please invest in this, because this is our future. If you know who is paying for the Democrats and the Republicans.
There you go.
Thank you, Janet. $54.
I like that.
Twice, $27 due to inflation. I love that. Yes, people, because of the Bernie campaign, a lot of people like the number 27. So donate 27, donate it twice like Janet did, donate it 3 times. But anything that people could do, it's going to make a difference. If what you could do tonight is $10, if you have $10 to give to this, I ask that you please do. Because again, the Democrats managed to do some damage. They didn't manage to win. And they had They had very expensive lawyers, and we had very heroic lawyers. And heroism won over well. Joan, I see you're doing 500. Thank you so much, Joan. Joan.
Thank you, Joan. Joan's
Right on, Joan.
Joan.
That's right. The progressive Democrats of America are trying to encourage the Democrats to take dark money out of the system. And the progressive Democrats of America, just like DSA, are going to keep going to the Democratic Party and asking them to do these things. And the Democrats will have but one answer. And because we're a respectable campaign, I'm just going to use this finger. But it's going to involve a single finger. Maybe two. So it's
Well, the dark money that they're talking about is the Citizens United money, and actually spoke with Joan. Not it's not like before Citizens United we had a wonderful campaign finance system that was fair and equitable, and like politicians weren't being bought. It wasn't like Mr. Smith Goes to Washington was some made up story, that nobody knew what they were talking about. In that film, like this has been something that's been going on forever. Going back to the Roman Senate. But Citizens United took it one step further, of course, by allowing the dark money, the money without any accountability, no idea where that money came from, to just be utilized, however, without coordination with the campaign, which of course is nonsense. But, just to give people an idea how big that is. And we haven't seen anything yet here in North Carolina. It's coming, though, that in a 2020 race in North Carolina for U.S. Senate between Tom Tillis and Cal Cunningham, $300 million was spent. Tillis, who won, the Republican, he spent $25 million. Cunningham, the Democrat who lost, spent $50 million. And $225 million in outside spending occurred. That's the dark money. That's the unaccounted for money. That's the money that just literally anyone can put into the race, use to advertise, pay for people to go door to door, utilize really for any purposes. That is unaccountable money that you don't have to know who that money is coming from. So $225 million was spent on the U.S. Senate race in 2020 through that dark money. And we've already we're seeing that now. I don't know if it'll get to be that much. I imagine it will, maybe more, but that's what we're up against. And so for me, how do I get my campaign known? How do I get my people out? How do I support my people? How do I pay my people? Right? Are my concerns. And certainly we don't have those kinds of resources. So I appreciate everything everyone has done, everyone can do. I recognize most of the names in this list, and I know a lot of you have given already and donated already. Andrew, who left, is no longer, he just gave today. So there's like other people who I know what you all have done, and I thank you. I'm grateful. And particularly then too, I'm really grateful for all the folks who've been working on this campaign, who are with us. Go through the list. I can see Barry, I see Janie, I see Janet, I see Nick, I see Maple, I see Scott, I see Stephanie, I see Susan, all these folks, of course, Rose, AP, Ryan, Dave, the guys who are on the back end of this, putting it all together. I appreciate everything they've done. This would be nothing without them. And we're going to do really great things, building a sustainable green movement here in North Carolina. Next week, Rose, we have...
Yes, I was going to announce that next week is going to be a debate with libertarian Shannon Dray at Davidson College. And that's going to be live streamed. So instead of a webinar, we're actually going to get to see Matt debate. Now, in terms of the debates for, with the Democrats and Republicans, at this point, it's not even clear that they're going to have a debate.
Right.
Both Sherry Beasley and Ted Budd seem very content to say very little. So we'll see if that even happens. But I'll tell you, we are going to fight to have Matt in it.
Right.
Absolutely. We're, trying to get the polls to start even reporting Matt's numbers. So that's something we're working on, because that's one of their criteria is 5% in the polls. Of course, they know that if Matt were in that debate, he'd have a lot more than 5% of the poll if people can actually see him. But Shannon Gray is an independent. I'm not a libertarian. He is. But you know what? The libertarians did have our back during this legal fight.
Absolutely.
And they believe in an inclusive democracy. So whatever our disagreements, this will be a respectful debate between Matt and Shannon Bray. The following week, on the 22nd, we're going to have author Margaret Kimberly join us. And there's going to be some discussion on the two-party trap for the Black community and how neither party is doing anything of value, and yet the Black community is pretty much told you must vote for one of these two parties. And wink, we know which one it is. But after, and then the following week will be on a Wednesday, and that's going to be September 28th. And we are going to have no other than Chris Hedges joining us. So I'm looking forward to the next few weeks. I will see you all in 2 weeks, because I will not be at the Davidson debate, but I will be watching. And yeah, Hedges. And thank you all for being here tonight. We very much appreciate everything you're doing to get this campaign out there, because this campaign, as great as Matt is, and I know he's great, but it would be nothing without the people.
Right. And thank you, everyone. Just to update, if we were supposed to be in Hickory, North Carolina on Saturday for the Catawba Valley Pride Fest, that has been postponed due to weather. So if you're going to go meet us in Hickory, we're not going to be there. I guess just a lot of rain will be there. So, but hopefully I'll see a lot of you all out and about across the state over the next couple months. And thank you for everything you're doing, all your support, and everyone have a good night. And Nicolanda out in Maui, have a good rest of your day.
Thanks very much, all.